Okay. So yeah, as Shane said, I'm going to be talking about heat and local energy governance today. Hopefully then leading on to what my ideas are for my MRes dissertation. And I'm particularly interested both for this and my PhD in kind of scales of governance as well, so it's something that I do plan to continue on. And I'm looking particularly at the role of local enterprise partnerships as a kind of scale of governance between central and local government and what their role in low carbon heat might be. As a very quick overview, I'm going to talk quickly about the significance of heat in energy policy, recent policy developments in that area, and particularly the role of heat networks and how government policy rhetoric has developed in that area. In relation to heat infrastructure, and particularly heat networks, I'm going to talk about the role of subnational governance, both local authorities and local enterprise partnerships, a brief review of current research, and in my view the lack of analysis of scales of governance, which is where the local enterprise partnerships come in, and I'll talk about what exactly they are a little bit later on. Leading on to what I'm proposing as kind of my research topic for my MRes dissertation, which is how local enterprise partnerships are supporting the delivery of low carbon infrastructure with a focus on heat networks in particular. So to say a brief word about the importance of heat, it's often described as a bit of a kind of neglected area of energy policy because there's far more focus on the role of the electricity sector in general. But as you can see from that diagram, it's very significant in terms of final energy use, accounting for 44% of final energy use, but also in terms of carbon emissions as well, because it accounts for about a third of carbon emissions directly from heat. It's very much dominated by gas at the moment, with about 70% of heat generated through the use of gas currently. Heat policy has very much kind of developed really. Initially, in government's low carbon strategies, there was a focus on the decarbonisation of electricity first, and then later a decarbonisation of heat through the electrification of heat, with heat pumps particularly playing a very significant role. That's really started to develop in, I'd say, the last 18 months with kind of more of a recognition in policy rhetoric of uncertainty on what the trajectory for heat policy might be into the future. And that quote there is from the 2012 Strategic Framework for Heat. And within those policy documents and the analysis that is supporting them through various agencies, there's more of a kind of focus on the role of heat networks, definitely within the last 18 months, but particularly within the last 6 months. And the most recent policy update, which was the Meeting the Challenges, Future of Heating, really focused on the role of heat networks, and also at the same time there was the announcement of a heat network delivery unit within DEC, and we're potentially also expecting a heat white paper later on this year, so it's a huge lot of activity in the area. This is kind of a schematic from that 2013, it was March 2013 policy document, which talks about kind of the changing role of both gas and heat networks. So previously there's very much focus on gas up to the mid-2020s, 2030s, and then a very rapid expansion of heat pumps, which obviously rely on electricity. And this 2013 policy document is suggesting there might be a long-term future for gas using kind of new technologies that can use gas and heat pump technologies combined, hybrid technologies. But also the bit I'm interested in is the bit at the top that's suggesting a more significant role for heat networks, particularly in urban areas. So to say a little bit about heat networks, they are basically the provision of heat from a central source directly to sites, homes, businesses, whatever, through a network of pipes. Not a new idea, has been used in this country and across the rest of the world for a long time. But I think the important thing to say, it's described as a technology neutral energy carrier. So the actual network just delivers the heat that can have a range of different technologies backing it up, some of which are more low carbon than others. So it can be gas fueled, combined heat and power, it could be a biomass system, heat pumps, large-scale heat pumps, using waste heat from industry, or a range of other different technologies. Some would argue that that makes them future-proof. So once the network infrastructure is there, you can incorporate different technologies as knowledge and the economic case for different technologies develops over time. So, for example, you could have a gas CHP system, which is efficient, but it's not zero carbon, obviously, and that could feasibly be replaced as knowledge and the kind of technological development develops with, say, a large-scale heat pump. They also described as having a very significant role in storage and system balancing. So they generally have thermal storage incorporated, which means that they help to balance the electricity system and the very kind of peaky nature of heat demand. So we obviously need a huge amount of heat on very cold winter days, not very much heat on warm summer days when we get them, and which makes it very difficult to deliver that very kind of peaky demand. So having thermal storage kind of smooths out that peaking. Although some argue that there's dangers of carbon lock-in, because if we, most technologies now are gas CHP, and once we install that technology, there's no guarantee that it will then progress onto a further low carbon technology into the future. In the UK, generally quite a low penetration at the moment, less than 2% of the UK's heat demand, although various studies suggest there could be quite significant potential. National Heat Map says that 50% of heat demand in England could be of the right density to make heat networks viable. At the moment, government analysis is generally saying that about 15% of heat demand could be economically viable, but you know that might change in the future as there's more studies. Generally, the low penetration in this country compared to the rest of Europe is because we've got a big gas network. We've historically had cheap North Sea gas, and we've also got high heating demand and low cooling, although it is far more prevalent in Scandinavia, which obviously also has a high heating demand. In Europe, you can see, particularly Scandinavia, but also increasingly Austria, Germany and France, heat networks are starting to have a far more significant penetration, and experience from those countries is suggesting that they've got a particularly important role in energy storage and managing intermittency, which links back to some of the comments I made earlier. And the table there from a UK-funded project is just reviewing what the plans are for rollout across a number of European countries. In the UK, we're going from a low base, but that's a 7-fold increase between now and 2030 within the penetration of district heat, so it is quite significant. One of the important things to say is that the 2030 policy update that I mentioned really gave a prominent focus to heat networks as a tool for regeneration and development. So it's really recognising the local benefits in terms of jobs, in terms of regeneration, in terms of energy security, and in terms of potentially profit from the functioning of that local energy system, depending on where the ownership of that system is. It could be with local public sector, it could be entirely privately owned. So it's recognising both the role for local benefits, but also the role for local agents in delivering heat as being really important. And there was lots of kind of commitments within there, including the Heat Networks Delivery Unit I mentioned, financial support for both local authorities and local areas as well. So some of these are kind of city region areas rather than local authorities. And a lot of work thinking about some of the barriers to rolling out district heat and heat networks into the future. However, the research backing up all of that developing policy, and also the research more broadly, very much focused on kind of barriers to implementation. So what are the skills, where's the finance coming from, why some local authorities might be more active than others, a huge amount on the technical studies, looking at which technologies are feasible now and into the future, and various carbon saving scenarios, and also looking at consumer attitudes. In my view, there's a gap looking at what the role is of different scales of governance in delivering low carbon heat generally, but particularly at a local scale, which is where heat networks are so significant. And the strategy documents go on to say that local authorities have got this pivotal role, but there's also this kind of conflict in that it's actually local enterprise partnerships, which I'll talk about in a moment, that are tasked now with planning strategic investment in areas, economic strategy, regeneration, and increasingly becoming this route for central government funding. And within the 2013 Strategy of Heating update, there's a statement that BIS and DEC will explore the use of European regional development funding to support district heat and heat networks through local enterprise partnerships. So there's this kind of gradual realisation that there probably is a role for local enterprise partnerships, seeing as they're so significant in infrastructure investment, but very little on exactly what their role might be. In terms of what they are, they originally were a commitment in the Conservatives' 2010 manifesto. They wanted to replace regional development agencies with these business-led local enterprise partnerships, which is what they did when they came to power in the coalition, and they were established in late 2010 as these joint local authority business bodies. So it's quite a dramatic change as being this combined kind of state and non-state organisation to support economic development across what they call functional economies. the map on the side is what all the areas are, which, you know, I'm not expecting to see what they all are, but it's just that basically they're bigger than local authority areas. So the idea is that they fit more with how actual real local economies work, which might not be a local authority area. It might be a region, might be a city region, it might be a group of cities. They've got a strong private sector focus, private sector chair governed by volunteers, which tend to be business leaders and also public sector leaders as well. They've had no formal powers and no dedicated funding, but they're increasingly receiving both central funding from government for startup and development, but also as a channel for growth funding as well. So they've been the route where a lot of the funding over the last 18 months has been channelled in terms of diversifying economic growth in the regions and stimulating growth, as well as EU funding as well. In terms of the responsibilities for energy, within the original documents setting out their scope and responsibilities, it was very clear that it included a responsibility for driving local green infrastructure, for stimulating green supply chains, and for developing what they call these green low carbon clusters, which is about areas recognising that they might have, you know, unique things that they do that make them more competitive and to pursue them. So it might be, say, Wave Hub down in Cornwall. So it was really clear in that initial document that they've got an important role for energy infrastructure. Since they've been developed, there's been a number of studies looking at, well, how successful LEP is going to be generally, with the Centre for Cities suggesting that they've made very varied progress and that there's reason to be concerned that they're not going to become effective bodies. Following that, the Institute for Economic Development suggested that their lack of resources and delivery powers and clear responsibilities could limit their potential and make them toothless tigers. There's an argument to say that might be changing, seeing as they're increasingly being seen as this delivery agent for central government funding. But what I think is very interesting is that there's very little looking at what their role is on energy, apart from that high-level strategy when they were initially developed. I think it's also significant to note as well that LEP is a highly political topic. It's all about devolving power away from the centre. RDOs were very politically seen to be a Labour idea. LEPs very much seen to be a Conservative idea with a strong role for the public sector. There's very little debate about what that means for energy infrastructure into the future. So for me, that really raises a lot of questions, given that heat is likely to be delivered at a local scale, with some sort of non-central government range of actors being very important. There's an increasing role for heat and an unclear local enterprise partnerships. So the questions it was raising for me were about how LEPs support the delivery of energy infrastructure, how they perceive their role, particularly for heat networks, and what sort of strategies, mechanisms, delivery plans they're adopting. I'm also interested in the decision making that takes place within them and with their partners for energy infrastructure, and how they interact with other scales, so how they interact with central government and also with other scales of governance in terms of the business sector, but local government as well. So broadly, what I'm kind of developing at the moment is to have this project aim to use LEPs as a lens to explore the role of scales of governance in energy infrastructure. So I'm particularly interested in this idea of multi-level governance, in that we've moved from this kind of central system where policy is set and implemented through government to this far more kind of complex, nested arrangement of different sorts of governments. And within that, the role of state and non-state has been very important, but the role of scale, so from local, regional to central, being very significant as well, both with how policy is formed but how it's implemented. So that's kind of broad framework, and my emerging research agenda is hopefully going to be to examine the emergence of LEPs and their role in local energy governance, but then to critically analyse the ways in which LEPs are used as a framework for getting more integrated policy making, which was their initial idea, but particularly using heat networks as a case study to look at how they're engaging in heat networks, what they're doing and how they're working with partners, and then obviously to look at their likely impact on heat networks. So my approach, as I'm kind of developing it at the moment, is going to be looking at the policy discourses on the role of LEPs in sustainable energy, focusing on heat networks, which will be kind of a critical discourse analysis, I think, and then looking to interview LEPs and stakeholders to explore what their role is, their engagement and views. But as I said, to kind of use that as a way to seek to understand their strategies, delivery plans and mechanisms, and then to get into more of the kind of detailed issues of governance, politics and power in local energy governance. So that's a very brief kind of race through my emerging ideas, which are probably somewhat less formed, I would imagine, than some of you that are in your first, second and third years. But that's my references, and thank you. And if there's feedback or questions or comments, that would be good. Should I stop it?
Do you see a difference in the sort of scales of governance in the other countries you constantly? Do you see any kind of interesting comparisons that can be made there for like more detailed research?
Yeah, like it's kind of one of the avenues I'm thinking about is using kind of comparator case studies in Europe, because they've obviously got very different local governance structures with stronger regionality, stronger mayoral systems, and you know, generally less centralised governance systems than we do in the UK. So I think, yeah, potentially maybe looking at Denmark or Germany, because I think Germany's got very, very active growth in district heat, whereas Denmark's far more established. So probably to compare to that have got, you know, growth potential. Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. That was very interesting. This is a what-if question, really. It may or may not be relevant, but given that LEPs are a Tory idea and they wiped out RDAs overnight almost, have you thought about how you might future-proof your research in terms of Labour coming back in and demolishing LEPs? And that might not happen, but is that something that is worth thinking about at an early stage?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think it is. But I think, like, I'm using LEPs almost as an example of as an approach. So I think the debates around which is better, the regional governance, local governance, and how they relate to central government has been going on far longer than RDAs or LEPs, I'm sure, will. So hopefully the kind of insight into how decisions get made and how kind of politics and power play out will be more widely applicable anyway. So.
How dependent are the LEPs on being in the matter
Yeah.
or in terms of being part of stuff? Has that sort of level of governance at that scale interacted with them?
Yeah. All of the LEPs will have the local authority or local authorities represented on them, and I think that's one of the really interesting areas by itself, is that some of them will just be one local authority, some of them will be 6 or 7 local authorities all working together, which all have very different priorities. So I think how that works is going to be very much based on the individual makeup of those authorities, and I think it makes it difficult for then how you draw bigger kind of lessons out of looking at the LEPs. But I think they'll all have, the local authorities will be on their board, but increasingly the funding is going directly through the LEPs rather than to local authorities. So the LEPs as a separate body will have quite a degree of power, in my view, in terms of how they influence the local authorities as well as vice versa.
Yeah. Thanks, Jess.